Welcome to Writer Syndrome, podcast about writing from start to finish. This episode's topic, POV, point of view. I'm Russ Capasso, and joining me in third person omniscient is Tim Letney.
Limited, third person limited today.
Okay, so little did he know he was joining me. Third person omniscient. So,
oh man, Russ, how's it going, man?
Pretty good. I'm excited and interested to talk about this because you and I have talked about this quite a bit, the old POV.
Yeah, it's been a stumbling block for me for a little bit, but we can get to that later.
Yeah, I figure let's just talk some of the basics of POV and kind of we'll go into like our own experiences with it and our own, let's just call it out, screw ups and how we've kind of maybe corrected those things or noticed them. So I mean, generally the idea, right? Point of view is just kind of the narrator's position and like description of like the events and kind of like in the world, right? And what's going on for connecting the reader to the characters within the story. Does that sound reasonable? I'm kind of pulling.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable.
Pulling that from a couple different sources, like kind of all describe it's like that in different ways.
And I would say it's really important to know your POV before you begin writing.
Yes.
It's not something that you want to necessarily change later on. I mean, I think it's okay to do it if you want to switch it up, but it's something you should kind of go into your work with some intentionality, I think.
Yeah, 100% agree. And we can definitely talk about it when we get into our own experiences because I made that mistake. So, and yeah, a lot of work.
So how many types are there? There's a few, right? What's first on the docket?
So there's 4 types typically, right? So you've got first person point of view, where your pronouns are like I, me, my, not to be confused with the Beatles song, I, me, mine. Your second, I don't know why that just popped in my head. Your second person point of view, right? Where you're using you. You see that a lot of times, like the old Choose Your Adventure, from games of the 80s and stuff. You enter an ice cave, right? I got some actually comments about the second person because that's not really used all that much in fiction, although I did read a series recently that used it to a kind of great effect. So, and then there's third person point of view limited, and then there's third person point of view omniscient, right? And those are kind of like the 4 major categories. I think within first person, there's like even more, there's like subcategories in there, like first person central and then first person peripheral. So I think first person peripheral is a good example is that the Great Gatsby, where the main character is, the person who's doing the narrating is a secondary character, but the main character is Gatsby himself. So
interesting.
Yeah. And I think for first person central, a good example is, I think, To Kill a Mockingbird. I have not read that, which I probably should have, but
it's weird. How do you feel about first person generally for contemporary fiction?
I'm fine. I'm fine with it. And I think like that, along with third person limited, are probably the 2 more popular uses. And we can also talk about the deep POV later, but I think those are the 2 most common ones, right? And I think about like my genre, and I'm curious from your genre because you read a lot of horror, I read a lot more thrillers and kind of mysteries. It'll bounce back and forth between those 2. Like first person, like there's 2 books I just read, one I just finished, one I'm reading right now. They're both in first person. They're both thrillers, and it's just because it allows you to like you to get into that character's head, right? And for a story like the thriller I'm reading right now, where this guy's trying to figure out who he is and what his memories are correct, that seems like the best POV to choose, right? To kind of parse through that and go through that adventure where you don't know what's going on because you are just following what the character knows, right?
I think I'm very particular about the POVs that I like to read. And I didn't realize this until I started paying a lot of attention to it.
Yeah.
I am very dubious of a first person narrator because I just don't trust them. I mean, I think there's so much suspension of disbelief that goes on during a book that when it's first person, sometimes the writer comes through and it feels disingenuous to me.
Yep.
I've certainly read some first person narratives that are wonderful. And other times I find myself going, really? Like, which is why, and we can talk about it when we get there, but which is why I think limited, or not third person limited, but like writing in third omniscient is what I enjoy the most. But there are loads of books and loads of horror novels in first person. I've read a slew lately. And it's funny because you're like, oh, you like reading horror novels. Interestingly enough, I hadn't read very many horror novels until I was looking for comps. I read a ton of novels.
Yeah.
Not a ton of horror novels.
Really?
But now I have. I mean, obviously King and Clive Barker and some of the classics like Victorian horror literature I was very into. But when it came to contemporary horror, it was more research based than it was enjoyment based about seeing what the field was. But you're right. There is a lot of first person. In fact, it was kind of difficult to find third person comps for a while.
Yeah.
At least looking at subject matter. But yeah, I don't love it. I don't even know if I like it. I don't think I like first person narratives.
That's interesting because like that's kind of one of the bigger, POVs to use in
yeah, it really is
in literature. And just to be clear, you're not talking about like an unreliable narrator, which is a completely different use of like a first person.
I would much prefer an unreliable narrator.
Which I guess like Fight Club would be a good example of that, right? Like unreliable
Fight
narrator.
Club, I think, is in second person, but it's certainly an unreliable narrator. Yeah. I mean, it's not that it's unreliable. And this is going to sound petty. I feel like often for first person narrators, it's unbelievable for me. It's harder for me to be kind of brought into the world.
Yeah.
And I like being in the hands of the omniscient narrator much more than I do the first person.
That's kind of interesting. I never actually thought about, I don't have a problem with it. I never thought about which one I liked, but now you're bringing this up. I'm just thinking about this book that I just read and it's in first person. And I didn't like it because it was unbelievable because based on the author and the character he was writing for, choosing first person was like, that's kind of a bold move, I think, for the type of character he was writing for.
So he was writing as somebody that was obviously not from the same background as himself?
Yeah, which I think maybe that's my own fault. Like maybe it's an own bias in my head of like, it's also just felt like the way that the person was speaking also felt like a 1940s noir detective. And it was really hard for my brain to not picture this. So like the main character is a female character, a gay female character, right? Okay. But they wrote them as kind of like this 1940s noir detective, which maybe was on purpose. Like maybe that was the point, to kind of give it like this noir feel. But I was struggling so hard I kept picturing this as a male character and I couldn't get my head out of it. And it just felt like, that's kind of an interesting choice as like and this comes back to like our men writing female characters too. Like interesting choice to choose that character to have the lens through, and also do it in first person. Cause like first person, you're getting pretty much, you're in that character's head the entire time. Might also just be my own problems, my own bias, but it
stood out to you, right? And it did not pull you into the story because you were doubtful because the author.
Yep.
And the subject matter he was writing on were so disparate. Yeah, I mean, I'll say that happens to me often when I'm reading. It's very distracting, yeah.
Very distracting. I don't know if that's a me problem or if that's a way the story is put together.
Oddly enough, right, I had read Ghost Story, right? I mentioned this a few podcasts ago. And that's omniscient third and also first person. So it jumps to a diary in the middle.
Oh, you mentioned this, yep.
But when it was teed up in that way, I don't know, it felt believable to me, but also that character had been established previously as existing in the world. So it did kind of feel like a document from this world as opposed to being inside the head of a character. So that didn't ruin the suspension. So I do think it can be done really well.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just, I just, as maybe a biased reader, I'm a little more dubious about first person. I do think they are very accessible. I think when I was younger, I liked them a lot.
Yeah.
Because it does, like first person narratives grab you immediately. You're just locked into that character's perspective. So all of a sudden you're forced to identify with them, whether you want to or not.
Right. Because there is a distancing with all the different types of point of view, right? Like, that second and first person is closer to the reader, whereas you get to the third person limited and omniscient, you're further away from the reader, right? So once you start using, pronouns like I or me or even you, right? It's like now it's me, the reader, in this position. So,
and that's actually why I have a hard time with first person as well, is that it is so limited. And we can talk about this with limited third too, is that as a reader and now as a writer, I really want a larger view of what's happening. And maybe that's because, I'm interested in film and I like kind of head hopping, and I like seeing that canvas be very, very broad, filled in, as opposed to whereas first person, point of view and even limited third sometimes feels like shining a flashlight in the dark. Like it's very much tunnel vision on where you're looking. Yeah. You don't get a very large canvas.
Second person point of view?
The only example that I think I've ever read is Fight Club. And I hope I'm right. I'm pretty sure that it's
I can't remember I read
second person. I mean, there's so many, like you wake up in Fort Worth, you wake up. I mean, at a minimum, it dips into second often, which makes a lot of sense thematically, right? If Palahniuk intentionally wrote in second person with the themes of that book, I think it fits well. I didn't even think about Choose Your Adventure. You're right.
Right. You enter the ice cave, you pick up a torch, right? Actually, and I was thinking the other one, the most popular one I can think of right now, which I read a while back, I've mentioned on here, is the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. And she goes first person, second person, and third person in that.
Wow.
So, and some of it's funny, I'm reading through these articles about tips of point of view, making sure you pick one and you kind of stick to it, right? But obviously there's certainly exceptions to the rule. And one of the other tips is if you are going to switch between point of views like first and third or whatever, just make sure you're consistent with it. Because you kind of regain the trust of the reader, and then there's a pattern that the reader can get comfortable with and kind of maintain the story structure. When I first started reading the first book of her series, the first chapters in first person, or no, the first two chapters I think are in second person, if I remember correctly. And I was having such a hard time. I was like, this is so awkward to read. And maybe because I haven't read enough second person,
there's
POV
not many,
stuff.
right? And very interesting too, because for me, at least, the first 30 pages of any book are really hard to get into. It's kind of before that spell is cast. I feel like I'm shoveling sand or something.
Yes. Yep.
So to do that and then also play with a rarely used POV is really interesting.
Yeah. But I'll say again, she kept it consistent, and the cycling through the different, character POVs and the different characters that were speaking in each of these point of views, right? Narration modes, I guess you can call them too. It started making sense, and you start getting into a rhythm. And then it was like, okay, this is natural for me to read this. And the payoff to it was beautiful. It was like, you got me. That was awesome. So it was totally worth it.
So it tied into the themes. I mean, it tied into the story. There was
yes.
a mechanism. There was a reason for it, having three different POVs. That's wonderful.
100%. And it all just came together, and maintain the story structure. And then once you get to the end, it all kind of just paid off. You're like, oh, okay, this was...
And you said that was the Broken Earth trilogy?
Yeah.
I'll check that out.
It's highly recommend, and worth a read. And second person, I guess you could count breaking the fourth wall, right, as a second person POV. That's kind of an interesting one, actually, right?
I don't know. Isn't that first person?
Well, if a character is breaking a wall and communicating to the reader, wouldn't that be second person?
Oh, I guess so. Yeah.
I guess the next types that are pretty common are third person limited and third person omniscient. So it's interesting because omniscient, I keep reading, it's certainly not. It feels like it's a little bit older of a style.
Yeah, it hurts me because it's my favorite.
And that's going to be more. You're getting more into the experience of all the characters in the story, right? You're bouncing around. Third person limited, you're setting up a scene with a particular character and you're sticking with their view within that scene. You can jump to a secondary character, but you got to make sure it's pretty clear, like a scene break and or new chapter. But while you're in limited, it's just their perspective of the world and what's going on.
I'll say with third person omniscient, I mean, they're very, very similar POVs.
They're kind of a mess to separate.
Yeah. And I think that's why I had such a hard time, which I'll get into, separating them, because third person omniscient can dip into third person limited at moments.
Yes. Yep.
Based on the scene. But I'll say the same thing. Like if you're doing that head hopping, even in third omniscient, you want to have a clear, either a page break or a new chapter, a new subchapter, something, because you don't want to confuse the reader. And there's some times that I've come across in books I've read where they don't do it. And it's, now that I'm paying so much attention to POV, it's very jarring. It's very jarring if all of a sudden you're in somebody else's head without it being a page break. Honestly, sometimes if I'm listening to a book over my headphones, if I'm walking the dog or something, and if it's in a printed book, there would have been a space there. But in an audio book, there isn't that space and it just jumps to somebody else, and I'm like, where?
Oh, interesting.
What's happening right now?
Yeah, and I think it's having the break plus establishing it really quickly within like the first couple of lines, whose head you're in. I got this a lot of feedback from my editor as well. Like there were some scenes I'd write where, she's like, yeah, I'm not sure where you are yet. And you're like 3 paragraphs in, I don't know whose head you're in yet. So like there was a lot of moving some dialogue or even just action moments up to the top, just so immediately you know whose head you're in.
For me, like the big difference is with third limited. So I just read Clown in a Cornfield.
Yep.
Which is very much, it's 99% limited third person.
Yeah.
There's certain moments, if like a character has gone through something traumatic, the narrator pulls back just a little bit, but for the most part, it's limited third. And it's neat, having that boots on the ground and feeling really locked in with the main character and the B character. I had a very hard time, and I can get to this later, writing from that perspective, because I have a tendency to want to pull out a little bit and show things that maybe the main character can't see, or share some information to the reader that maybe the main character doesn't quite know yet. And that's based on the books I like to read. I think King is very much omniscient third, but I think you're right that it's more contemporary to use, for some authors to use limited third person. I just don't love it. Although I am trying to write in it for a short story right now.
Yeah.
But honestly, I'm writing on it because it's like limiting, and as an exercise to not, to be a little more focused and honed in on that character and that character's experience without going first person. Yeah. It almost seems like in my head, it's the middle ground between first person and third person omniscient. You've got this limited third where it's still, to me, a little more believable, but very narrow in focus.
Should we get deep into the deep point of view? To me, and like the research I've been doing over the last couple of years, and this feels like a more newer kind of concept, or maybe almost buzzwordy type of thing. This deep.
I think I need to be educated on it. Can you give me a little breakdown of what it is?
Basically, I pulled this from the Masterclass website, which has got a pretty good breakdown of the deep point of view. But it's a way of writing fiction in third person limited. It silences the narrative voice and takes the reader directly into a character's mind. While third person limited writing attaches to a single character and refers to them by their name or pronouns, deep POV takes it one step further, eliminating filter words and writing as the character instead of about them. They have an example here. I don't know if you want to read this sentence. I do, because I'm still confused about what it is. I was too, and I had conversations with my editor about this as well. And she had made notes of, things to start cutting out to get deeper into the character's point of view. And I was like, what does that even mean? I'm like, I can't go any deeper. I'm drowning. So they have an example here. So like this is the, this first sentence would be like just third person on the right. So he peered out the window. Are they coming for me? And like in quotes, he wondered as he listened to the sound of distant hoofbeats. Now rewriting that into deep POV would be, he peered out the window. Were they coming for him? Hoofbeats rumbled in the distance.
Oh, kill me. That's so similar.
You're eliminating that he wondered as he listened. You're just kind of getting right into, were they coming for him question, and then cutting right to the sound that he's hearing in the distance. Like, yeah, you're just cutting some fat here, but seems,
oh my God.
Yeah, it seems wishy-washy. I don't know. What's the word?
I think one of the reasons why I like Omniscient is because I feel like you're allowed to choose from all these different toolkits in a way, whereas the other more limited POVs kind of restrain you. Mm-hmm. So there's moments with like Omniscient Third where the narrator is speaking from the perspective of the character. Still the narrator, but he's kind of empathizing with that character. I feel like King does that quite a bit. But with this deep third POV, those two sentences are identical to me. But as a reader, I don't know if I would, I don't know. The idea is what? To make it feel more
you don't like it,
and you're closer to the character.
You don't like it because it would lower your word count.
I got to lower it about 18K actually.
Yeah, I don't know. So some of the things that it continues on, right? Like reasons why to write in this, and like I'll just do the quick bullets here. So it's like creates a deeper connection between the readers and the characters, maybe because you're shortening the narrative distance between the readers and the POV character. Sure.
But can't you do both? Like I feel like for certain scenes of effect, right? Like maybe if it's you're reaching a climax, or, tension is like escalating, the stakes are raised.
You could probably dip into
I
deep
feel like
POV.
then I'd kind of like cut away some of those words to make it more immediate and punchy.
Yeah.
Is there examples of entire books written in this deep POV, or is it just moments of it?
There's no examples here of entire books written in deep POV.
Because I'd say as like a tool to use, great, perfect. Big thumbs up. I think you want to be as close to the character in certain scenes as possible.
Yeah.
But as like an always type of thing.
Yeah, I think it's you think about that first sentence, right? I think it's if you're eliminating the stuff like he wondered as he listened, you eliminate that stuff, right? That's what you're going to kind of get deeper into the character's POV.
And I think if you're getting into a flow, almost like dialogue, right? Like you don't always need to say, Russ said, Tim said. Eventually you get into a flow. And I'd say the same thing with character thoughts or character experience, that eventually the reader knows whose POV you're in, and that you don't need those kind of signifiers of who's experiencing it.
Some of the other things they throw out here is to why, a reason why you want to do it is like it strengthens character development because you're nestled, I guess, a little bit deeper into the character's head because you're not having those filler words. This is a tough one, like makes a storyline come alive, I guess, because you're more immersed and you don't have those he wondered, he listened type of tags that kind of would separate you, the reader, from the narrative. It's a more concise way of writing. Sure, definitely.
Yeah, sure.
That's absolutely right.
Not to always compare things to movies, but it feels like the speed, I think it would be a good tool to use for pacing.
Yes.
And I feel like, at least personally, it's something that I wouldn't crack out of the gate with, but eventually I would introduce as things start moving along at a clip. And I say like film, like it'd be quicker edits.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it's a variation of third person limited. So I think, like you said, this doesn't feel like something it feels like you can go into this in certain moments and scenes based on. Yeah, I agree. Like you could, if you have a really intense scene, cutting into like this deep POV would probably heighten that tension or, whatever moment's happening or whatever conflict's happening. Yeah. But then if you're, moving to something that's a little bit more establishing, you can probably bounce back up to the limited and have, some of those breezy words, if you will. Yeah. And then everything else in here is, so like how to write in deep POV, like, all right, create an in-depth character sketch before you start writing. Sure. Use the character's voice instead of the narrative voice. You're cutting out the middleman basically, right? Which we just kind of talked about, getting rid of like dialogue tags and moving them more into action, which we, talked about. Show, don't tell, that's for everything, right? And using an active voice. So active verbs and rather than passive voice, constructions to place action at the center of the scene. But I think those are kind of just general writing tips. So
yeah.
And then here you go at the very end here, use deep POV in scenes that call for it. See, we know this stuff. We can masterclass this shit. So
we're masterclass.
You might write your book in limited third and reserve deep POV scenes for that warrant a more introspective look. Look at us. I didn't even get there.
That's cool.
You can use it here and there. So those are like the four major types in a little discussion.
There's one other, which is very rarely written in, right? Which I had confounded with omniscient third, which is objective third.
Yes,
there's barely any examples. I think there's like some Hemingway short stories or something.
Yeah.
So I had confounded the two. I had wrongly thought that Cormac McCarthy wrote an objective third, and he doesn't. It's omniscient. So Russ, what was your experience with POV? Did you start with one out of the gate that you knew that you wanted to write in?
Nope. I did all the things that we said you should do. I did all these things wrong. So.
So what'd you start in?
Let me name the ways. So my first draft was in first person. And then I realized that wasn't going to work. I think after...
So you wrote the entire book in first person perspective?
Yes.
Wow.
Because I had no idea what I was doing.
And what's it in now?
I didn't read all these nice articles before.
You didn't have a friendly, helpful podcast.
I did not to help
give you advice.
Yeah, before I started down this path. So I started in first person. I don't know why I picked that. I think maybe because at the time I only had one character in mind that was going to be traversing through this entire story, and that makes sense, right? No. So then I finished first draft and then read it, and I was like, this doesn't feel right. And I was also like, oh, there's other characters I think I want to have their point of view, because this is a thriller and it's more of like an espionage thriller, and I can bounce between characters. And then I started reading more, and then I started finding some of these articles, and I was like, oh, okay, yeah. So then the second draft, I switched over to third limited. At least I thought I did.
Did you know what third limited was at that moment?
No. So mistake number 2. Mistake number 2 is I basically just went to third person. I don't think I knew the intricacies or the differences between omniscient and limited. So I switched over to third person, and I started feeling better, because then I was like, okay, well, I have 2 other characters who I want to jump in their heads and have these different point of views of how the story's unfolding and what they're seeing. And it feels a little more kind of in the action thriller, adventure feel, and kind of other novels I had read in the same category were doing similar things with multiple characters. So I was like, okay, well, let's do that. And then I went to, that was pretty much it. So then once I handed it off to, I did my best, and I started reading these, and I was like, or reading articles about limited and omniscient. I was like, okay, I am definitely doing this very wrong still, not being consistent with it and kind of bouncing around. A lot of head hopping in those early drafts, even up to the third draft. Even now, editor is still catching stuff. She's like, oh, you're head hopping here a little bit. Where all of a sudden, like, I'm in one character's POV, and then halfway through they're having a conversation, but I jump to a secondary character that they're having a conversation with, and they have all these thoughts and feelings of the moment. Yeah. And that was a no-no. So just kind of learning along the way. But now I know, okay, this should have been from the start, third person limited, maybe some moments of deep POV, which I do touch on in some moments. So, but yeah, that was a big mistake. And other things I learned, establishing that POV within those first 2 paragraphs, and doing it quickly if you're going to change a scene or even a chapter and you're jumping to another character. So yeah, pretty much all 4 of these things that the kind of our thoughts and tips we gave in the early on, I screwed those all up. And it added time. It adds time. But it was also a learning process. Like, I completely failed at all these things. And it was a mess, but you go through, you let people read it and see how they react and if they can understand the pacing and what's going on. But yeah, so total mess.
How involved was your so when you went from first person to third, how involved was that rewrite? Like,
holy smokes.
Really? Yeah.
I think going into the second and third drafts, I think there was still some lingering I did this moments. I think maybe you might have even caught some at that point. It was terrible to have to go through that. But at the same time, I learned quite a bit.
Yeah.
Then I was going through this and switching to this completely different POV, obviously. But then I was thinking more about the world, which is kind of a weird thing, because if you're in first person, you should be thinking very deeply about the world and, the character's mindset. But I was thinking a little bit more on the action and how that would play out. And I think it got me to kind of, think more about the scene and not just, here's a bit of dialogue and then, quick 2 lines of like, here's the thing they discover and move on. It kind of got me to like kind of flesh the world out a bit more and think more about the characters. So it was a learning process. I don't ever want to go through that again, because that was a nightmare.
And when you were moving into third, and then when you passed to your editor, did you have any moments of third omniscient that you had to cut out to make it third limited?
There was a couple moments of that happening, which I guess would be the head hopping, probably, right?
I mean, for me, and we can get to me rambling about my trials and tribulations, it's when I pull back and I show something that the main characters cannot see.
Yeah.
Like visually see. Like I'm describing a scene or the scale of of an action beat, or maybe something's happening 5 houses down or something. It's very much the narrator. It's kind of moving around a little bit.
I had that problem with the characters who I didn't have established solidly early on. And I think you even probably notices that. Like, and everyone that read, like, I've got this one character, Lilo, who is my hacker awesome character. And I just saw that character. And, I had a backstory for her already. And you can tell the difference from when I write her chapters versus when I write my other characters' chapters, because I had her sketch and her world and like ideas for the other books for her already, and like and that shows up, and it totally showed up. Yeah. And everyone kept saying
there was an energy in those early drafts, right, in her chapters. that was absent in Eliot's chapters at the
Yeah,
time.
right. Which I think comes back to like, even before you get into the whole process and picking your POV, like know your characters and have a pretty good understanding of who they are from behind the scenes. Cause then it makes you write such stronger scenes. And like, I knew who she was. I knew she had this paranoia. I knew that she was running to survive. And that all shows up in the way that you write and from that character's perspective and what they're seeing in the world. So yeah, I think that would like, and my other characters who weren't well established, I was definitely bouncing to this omniscient or head hopping and doing whatever because I didn't have their world view locked in yet. Did you have your POV established in the beginning? Because you go through multiple characters as well, like I do, right?
So I have, not intentionally. I'll say that I began writing in third person omniscient. I didn't know what it was called. I just knew that like I was probably regurgitating a lot of books I liked and narrators in that kind of entry point and tone of the book. So there was no intentionality behind what I chose the POV other than this is how I think books sound, which is probably terrible to say, but I think that's just kind of like, and I'll say with my older writing, my narrator was too much character. Like not in this book per se, but in some of my older short stories or a novella that I never finished, he's like, my narrator is always this kind of curmudgeonly, judgmental, angry bully. Mm-hmm. And I very much did not want that to happen. So as I was reading a bunch of other books, because I was like, how am I supposed to write? I know I'm in third, but I was really having a hard time before I had the language to describe it. The difference between limited third and omniscient third and when I use what. And I think there is some flexibility in now that I've done some research in third person omniscient where you can have moments, in your story where you do kind of dip into the character for a moment, but you can pull back as well.
Yep.
And, you called me out I had these moments where my third person omniscient narrator is at his worst when he's trying to create tension or suspense by teasing the reader that something's going to happen that the characters don't know yet. It's kind of like they thought everything was going to be okay.
Yeah.
They were wrong. And I deleted all that gobbledygook. But
yeah,
because I don't know.
Was that a leftover from like things you have read though, right? And like,
yeah, I think so. I mean, I think maybe more ham-fisted than what I've read, but I think that sentiment is there. So I took a lot of inspiration, from Tolkien, oddly, but also from recent King. So I was like, I kept opening King being like, because I had a POV crisis. I was like, what the hell am I doing? Yeah. What am I doing? Am I doing it wrong? Because I was doing head hopping and I was not like you did, right? I had these scenes where there was no page break, where I would have a chunk of maybe limited third with one character. And then that character gets maybe indisposed for some reason, whether there's violence or they're not feeling well or something. And then I would jump to another character. But a slice of it, not big enough for its own subchapter.
Yeah.
So I cleaned all that up, but I was like, what am I doing? So I realized you don't want to jump from head to head. You want to be as clear to the reader as you possibly can be about where you are.
Yeah.
But also there's moments where, and I talked about this before, one of the reasons why I didn't feel comfortable doing during a rewrite of a limited POV, a limited third POV, was because I want the reader to see things the characters don't.
Yeah.
Because I'm dealing with scale. I'm dealing with an outbreak story where a lot of things are happening. And if I have to rely on the character as camera to always pick up what's happening, to me, that's limiting and also almost unrelatable.
Yeah.
Because when you're in a panic situation, you're not poetic or looking around and picking up every little detail. You're thinking about, let's get the heck out of here.
Yeah, yeah.
So I wanted to talk about the scale without making these heads on swivels, constantly picking up all the details that I wanted to get to.
Yeah.
So that's where I landed. And I think Third Omniscient is the right fit for this story. Mm-hmm. But it took a lot of, I think I still probably have some POV issues that I need to iron out. And then that's not even to get into when I chose the wrong POV. So I had a scene that should have been an emotional scene for my main, because they're returning to, one of their old haunts.
Yeah.
I wasn't in her POV. I was in the B character's POV for that whole chapter.
Yeah.
It wasn't until the rewrite that I was like, why am I in his head? Like he doesn't even know what this place is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think the solution was I was in his head at the time because I was more comfortable writing as him. So when I went back, I rewrote the whole thing from hers. And I think the scene is way, way stronger. I think it has much more tension. It's got more emotion to it broadly. And maybe I'm wrong. Who knows? Maybe like omniscient third, you're not supposed to dip into limited third, but I do at moments. And then I pull out at moments.
It feels like the line is somewhat messy. And I think there's a point where, like, obviously with practice of writing in either one or getting feedback on maybe certain moments where you can identify that you're jumping from the different types, you can start cutting that and be like, okay, maybe I need to focus more on being within the one or the other. But probably
what I did do, right, is like with the narrator, I made sure the narrator identified with the character they're with at the time. So the metaphors that are used, the way the narrator is presenting things, even the language, right? So like when I'm writing Third Omniscient and I'm with the 8-year-old boy, my narrator, the language is broken down. The metaphors are, around candy and toys and stuff. Like I'm very much trying to parallel the narrator with the character. For better or worse, who knows if you're supposed to do that?
I think at the end of the day,
I thought it was a novel, fun idea.
Yeah.
So,
well, at the end of the day, too, if breaking some of those rules works for the story itself, I mean, that can be completely fine. But
I do feel like in Mr. Mercedes, King does that. There's moments where the narrator is with the antagonist, and the narrator very much becomes this racist, misogynistic, terrible character. But it's not limited third. It very much is omniscient third, where the narrator has switched gears a little bit and switched empathy with this despicable character, which then makes for a despicable narrator. It's really kind of odd and jarring. But also, I think if you're not tuned in, because I was like reading all these books as like writing class. I think if you're sitting down to enjoy it, there's a really good chance, if you're doing it right, the POV and the narrator just vanishes anyway, right? Because you're along for the ride and you're along for the story. And as much as Omniscient Third, I think, was a good fit for Critical Mass, right now I'm trying to work in Limited Third because I have a story that's intentionally smaller in focus. And I do want to be very proximate to the main character. And I think Limited Third for that smaller tale fits. Also, I just need to practice writing in it, I think. So I think it'll be a good, even if this short story doesn't go anywhere, or novella doesn't go anywhere, it'll be good to practice Limited Third with some intentionality.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, it's like a little relieving almost that there's fewer options. The scale feels smaller. I think I might, not head hop per se, but I might have a chapter that goes into a different Limited Third.
Yep.
Because you can do that, right? You can change the characters that you follow, but in a way the scale feels much smaller, but it fits. Critical Mass is like a big outbreak story in a city, and this like little vampire tale is for me a small suburban vampire story, which it feels more intimate to me.
I think the challenge of writing in first and versus third person limited, or any third person, right, is pacing too. I think when I the first draft I wrote in like first person, again, I didn't consider pacing. I don't think you don't think about it. I didn't know it and how it impacted the story until after I finished it and I read it and I was like, this is boring. I think it's kind of interesting to think of like the pacing, because like now I've got 3 characters, right? Multiple character, third person limited. And now I'm like bouncing between them at different moments in time. And it kind of heightens and has this now kind of this pacing that it moves, and being consistent with when they show up too is something I've kind of found interesting. But I think that's something also to consider when you're choosing your point of view is the pacing of the story, and how can you whichever way you go, how do you make that kind of work, because it's pretty important for like that another layer of connecting with the reader. So
yeah, I mean, for me, I think one of the reasons why sometimes with the scale of things, first person and Limited Third are not enticing is because the scope is so much smaller and more intimate And I think if you approach your story with that intentionality, that's fine. But lately I've read some examples. Like I read a first person example where the main character was a designer.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's like a graphic designer on computers and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we're getting the story from their first person perspective. But when they are describing nature or where they are, it's very poetic. Like they don't sound like a graphic designer. They very much sound like a graduate student in English, perhaps a PhD. It's like this very effusive, beautiful language. But for the main character that is established in her interests, there was like a big split between those two things. And then with limited third, like I read Clown in a Cornfield, which is, quite enjoyable. But when it's limited third, it's like, and then she felt the knife stab her leg, and there's this minutia of detail of like the blood trickling, and it's like it takes me out of it in that moment because nobody would be thinking about that in such detail, in such like microscopic zoom in detail. Then that's to me when when the author drips through, and when I can see the author's choices, suspension of disbelief completely falls apart for me.
Yeah.
And I think maybe there's a fear, right? Like if you're writing a limited third, I think you need to write more contained and more focused, which gives you less options to be, I don't know, like prosaic and use long words and sound fancy.
Writing in first person with my main character, I'm like, this is like a 50-page novel. I feel like I needed like a little more bulk to it. So I was like, well, and just reading in genre expectations, going from multiple characters' point of views and building that tension from different angles felt right for the story, felt right for what I was trying to capture. But I was also like, man, if you just cut it down, like each of these three characters' stories by themselves is very short.
It's probably not a coincidence that I would venture to guess, and I can speak from my own experience and now yours, that most first attempts are probably first person.
Yeah.
It probably feels the easiest and most comfortable and accessible to write in off the bat.
Yes. And that's the other thing too. That first draft, it's basically me. It's just me, right? It's me talking. Because I had no idea. I had no concept, no idea of how to actually develop this character and it not be me. Right choice on my part. So pat myself in the back for changing that.
That's interesting, right? So if your first draft in first person was kind of you as author, as like an avatar in that space, which has since been refined and changed. And now that your main character has like more nuance to them. It makes a lot of sense, right? That there was this electricity when you're writing as Lilo, because that character was a fully formed character and not just an avatar at the time for the writer.
Yes.
Right.
100%. Yep.
So then when you went back and you injected that kind of character into your main, now those scenes have that kind of momentum that the other scenes as Lilo had.
100%. And even
Cool.
the secondary character, like his friend, like writing that character and giving him his own voice, and he's got his own thing, and that's fun to write now because it's just it's been an interesting process. But so what have you been reading? You got and what POVs are they in?
Am I allowed to say this? I'm reading Rage by
I don't know.
Stephen King.
Is that okay for you?
Well, by Bachman, I guess. Well, because it's out of print now. It's one of the books that he was okay, like in a post-Columbine world, to say, okay, we're not printing this anymore.
Okay.
So I've come across a copy of Rage, and I'm reading that. It's about a school shooting. It's in first person. I'm reading it kind of as a comp to that vampire story that I'm working on. I don't have strong feelings about it yet.
Yep.
I completely understand why he allowed it to go out of print.
Yep.
But, I never feel great when you can't find art anymore.
Yeah.
And it was kind of hard to track down. So, I'm reading that and just finishing up The Elementals, which is wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Such a great book. Written by Michael McDowell. He was responsible for the scripts for Nightmare Before Christmas and Beetlejuice. I had no idea kind of getting into that. The first 30 pages of this book were so amazingly difficult to read, but it really picks up. That is in omniscient third person. There is so many characters. It must have been so hard not to head hop. He doesn't.
Yeah, yeah.
But the narrator's in there at moments telling you how certain characters feel. But no, it's a great book. I highly recommend it. I'm just coming to the end of it now. I have 50 pages left. But it's a great ghost story.
Nice.
It's actually pretty scary, which is rare, honestly, to read. He plays with darkness a lot, which actually I tried to do a bit in Critical Mass. I feel like it's one of the things that books gets much better than any kind of visual medium can, playing with darkness. Because you're relying on a character's imagination than as opposed to what they're seeing. It's way easier to imagine being in a dark room and something scary happening than seeing kind of like a blue lit screen of somebody pretending they can't see anything. So
yeah.
Those moments are really wonderful.
Nice.
Yeah, highly recommend it.
Nice.
What about you, Russ? What are you reading or watching these days?
I just finished 2 books. I finished reading that Paradox Hotel by Rob Hart in first person. It's a fun, quick read, some time travel stuff. It was good. I'm doing some comps and just research for my next book, which will have a little time travel aspect to it.
And those space-time videos, those PBS space-time videos
so much fun
on YouTube. I love those, dude.
They're so good.
They're so good.
Outside of that, I finished second book of the Mistborn series, Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson. I think it's one of his earlier series, pretty old, but that's multiple characters, fantasy, third person, limited, I think. But it jumps to like a lot of different characters throughout. It was great read. And I just started reading Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. I had just finished reading his Recursion book, kind of leading into his stuff because he gets into some time travel-y stuff. And this one's in first person. And I think to good effect because, you're following this character trying to figure out what's happened to his brain, his memories, and his life that he had lived for 10 years has kind of disappeared, and other people think, that's not the life he was living. So it's like, oh, I can see why you wrote this in first person because you're kind of trudging along with this character. So that's pretty good. Yeah, that's been pretty much it for reading. But yeah, I think that's it. That's our episode. So thanks everyone for listening. Well, if you enjoyed the episode, think someone else might like it, send it along. If you have any topic ideas or any feedback, or you just want to chat, you can hit us on Twitter at writer_syndrome.
Ew, Twitter.
Yeah,
We're going to stay there?
I don't know.
Are we going to be new Mastodon people?
I feel like we said this at the end of the last episode, so we'll see how long it lasts. But for now, you can find us there.
Yeah. You're going to drop some links there, right? Some resources, or on the cast? Are you going to drop them?
We can do it on both. I think we'll throw them out there on the Twitter account. And you can head over to writersyndrome.com for all the episodes, contact info. And as part of this episode, we'll include some links to some of the in-depth point of view articles, which I found really useful. So it'll set you off on your own point of view rabbit hole. So
and hopefully save you many hours
hopefully
of rewriting and researching and
listening to this half hour will help you know the pain of choosing the wrong POV to start your 90,000 word novel. So next episode, what are we doing?
What do you want to chat about? What do you got in the docket?
I think we're talking about some goals, right? Starting the new year, new us.
Goals.
Yeah.
New year's, new me, new goals.
Yeah, I don't know what that's going to entail, but it's probably a good idea, right? Maybe we could talk about
goals.
Yeah, we could talk about our own writing goals for the year, and how are we setting them, and if it's working or if it's not.
My goal will be to prepare for that episode.
Yeah, we'll see how that goes. Until then, little did Tim know he's not going to prepare his goals.
Oh, bad POV.
Oh, no, he screwed that all up. Until then, keep writing.